My name's Richard Blum. I'm named after the Blum Center here of Developing Economies, and we're thrilled to be hosting today's event, Megatrends in Foreign Policy. Since we founded the Blum Center about 7 years ago, it says 8, but I think it's 7, we've had over 13,000 students through our classes just at Berkeley, and we are now in most of the other campuses. And so I want to thank so many of you who have been part of our program for doing what you're doing. It certainly makes all of us feel like we're doing something worthwhile. Now, I have 3 favorite women in politics, which 2 of them are here tonight. Jennifer Granholm, 47th governor of Michigan 2003 and 2011. And my other boss, besides my wife, Dianne Feinstein, being Secretary Albright, she, besides being a great Secretary of State, is chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and I'm on her board, so I have to leave here first thing in the morning to go to her board meeting on Monday, and she runs a great show. The program's going to run like this. Jennifer will we'll just basically converse with Secretary Albright for a half an hour, and then we're going to open it for questions for about 25 minutes, if that's okay with everybody. I think a number of you have handed in your questions. So anyhow, that's the program. So without further ado, I will ask 2 of my 3 favorite women politicians to come out.
Go, girl, go. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Madeleine.
Okay.
Well, so exciting to be able to welcome you to UC Berkeley. You've got a big fan base out here, and a number of them have already asked questions. So I want to get right to the substance of things, so people who haven't been in your presence can appreciate your charm and wisdom and all of that.
All those things.
Now, I know as we were coming out here, she said, can we just do Madeleine and Jennifer? And so I'm going to call her Madeleine at her request, but I don't want you to think I'm being disrespectful, okay? Okay, so the title of this event is Megatrends in Foreign Policy, and obviously you're the person to go to. So give us some idea about what we should be looking for in foreign policy in terms of megatrends.
Anyway, it's great to be here with you, Governor Jennifer.
Wait, are you going to call me governor after that?
No, but it's wonderful to be here and great to be with all of you. And Richard, thank you so much for not just inviting me, but making sure over and over again that I would come, because this is a terrific audience and a great school that you have. So thank you. I have been thinking about megatrends quite a bit, mainly because it's so difficult to explain what's really going on in some rational way beyond trying to put it into a larger context. And I think there are 2 big ones happening. And what I find interesting about them, and I'll talk about them in a minute, is that, in fact, we are all used to dealing with contradictions as we make decisions. But these megatrends have created their own contradictions. And that's what makes it particularly difficult. So the first one is whether you want to call it globalization or interdependence. But what has happened is that Americans don't like the word interdependence because it makes us sound dependent. But the bottom line is how whatever happens in one place affects other things, and whether it's a financial crisis or a global pandemic or climate change, but definitely the global aspect of this. What has happened is that the contradiction it has created is that people feel lost within this very large kind of orbit. And so what they've done, we have all done, is actually affiliate ourselves with a smaller and smaller group, whatever our identity is, whether it's ethnic or religious or national. And so despite the fact that there is this globalization, we have all kind of grouped with ourselves. And that would be fine. It would be fine to be proud in what you are. But the problem is that it leads to, in some cases, hatred of the other group. And so the various difficulties that have been created is by that identification and in its most virulent form, nationalism, that creates all kinds of international problems.
So before you go to the second one, let me just ask about that, because you see that sort of in the U.S. now, even in politics, where people sort of segment themselves by the cable channel that they watch and identify in a certain way. You're saying that this is happening globally, and so how does that manifest itself from the conflicts that we are seeing right now? Give us a good example.
Well, for example, you take what has been happening in Europe. Europe had moved, it was the victim of the bloodiest century in the 20th century of people killing each other, and all of a sudden they then decide after World War II that there will be the European, it started with the coal and steel community, becomes the European Union. People think this is really moving forward in a number of ways. So all of a sudden, one, there are economic difficulties, and what happens is that people go back to their national backgrounds. So all of a sudden there are the Germans and the Italians, and then within that some subgroups in the Balkans, complete division. And what has happened in Europe that I found so distressing is there is actually prejudice. The Northerners are very critical of the Southerners. The Northerners work hard, the Southerners are lazy. So there are divisions that have come up again in Europe which are reflective of some of the problems that had happened in other areas. Or, in another part of the world, Sudan, South Sudan. All of a sudden there are problems between the president and the vice president, which is then broken down into ethnic differences. Or you look at various, in China, even in China there are differences. So what has happened, what I'm troubled by the most, however, just to kind of spread this out a little bit, the nationalism point. I think one of the most worrisome issues that's out there right now is what is happening in the South and East China Sea. And part of what is happening is virulent anti-Japanese feelings among the Chinese and the South Koreans, who are remembering what happened in World War II, and the Japanese who are visiting shrines. And it is coming out in terms of who has what island in the middle of the South and East China Sea, and there could be an accident and we could have a mess. So it's that kind of a thing, but it has come about partially, I think, because people feel lost in this kind of global world.
You have to cling to something. So what do you do in, I know we're going to get to your second trend, but what do you recommend that we look at in terms of a more unifying measures or policy? How do you get over it?
The truth is I don't know at the moment, because part of the thing that's happened out of these megatrends, and we'll talk about the next one, is that what has happened is whatever structures existed for the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of this one was international infrastructure, mostly viewed in terms of the United Nations or regional alliances, but there's real question as to whether they work or not. There's lack of faith in those international
There's a lack of faith, but you just said there's a question as to whether they actually work.
There is, actually. I mean, for instance, the United Nations. I was ambassador at the United Nations. I grew up with the United Nations. My whole career is based on the fact that I won the United Nations contest when I was a sophomore in high school for the entire Rocky Mountain Empire.
Wow.
And it was because I could name the countries. At that time, there were 60 in alphabetical order. So, but now there are 193.
You too could be Secretary of State.
But what happens, let me just give you an example about the UN. Security Council is like the Rubik's Cube. So what happened, it needs to be bigger in order to really reflect the distribution of power in the 21st century. It started with 11 members, it expanded to 15, and when we were in office at the end of the 90s, we had suggested that Germany and Japan be members of the Security Council. The first country to come to me to object were the Italians, and they said, "This is outrageous. We lost the war too," which is not a great campaign slogan. So then the other problem is that out of 15 countries, there are probably 5 Europeans at any given time. So when I was there, I'd go to a European ambassador to ask for help on a vote, and he'd say, "I'm so sorry I can't help you. The EU does not yet have a common position." And then 2 days later, I go back to the same person. I'd say, I now need your help. And he'd say, so sorry, can't help you. The EU does have a common position.
Oh, my goodness.
Which means that the EU should have one permanent seat, but you know that the British and French won't give up their permanent seats. And it is based on a post-World War II system. So that is the problem. The other problem, which I don't have to expound on too much, is people do not have faith in their national institutions either.
Right.
And so the problem is that the infrastructure that you need in order to make this work, I think, is very difficult. And the other part is a whole new phenomenon, which is the rise of what we call the non-state actors. I mean,
is this the second megatrend?
No, the second
okay.
megatrend.
All right.
I can.
You're
get
still
to
no, wait. Keep going on the
but
first one.
Let me put
We're
the
going to get to the
non-state
second.
actor on the scene. The whole system is based on states.
Yeah.
And yet we know that a great deal of power is held by non-state actors, and people automatically think terrorists. But the bottom line is there are other non-state actors, multinational corporations,
right.
non-governmental organizations. So take, for instance, Coca-Cola has more influence and reach in the world than some small country. That small country has a vote in the United Nations, pick an island state somewhere, and Coca-Cola or other businesses or NGOs have no vote at any time, and yet some of the things that they do have tremendous effect on the international system. So we haven't figured out how to integrate them into it in a structural way.
Wow. So the UN doesn't work, and the non-governmental actors are sort of absorbing the role of governments in many places and having impact. People are being more isolated and clannish, if you will, because of the fear of this rise of multilateralism. I'll just say that. So that really doesn't sound too good. What's the second megatrend?
One, and
I
again,
hope it's better
the
news.
megatrend. I mean, let me just say, I don't think globalization is bad. I'm just saying that it created this other contradiction. So the other one is the evolution of technology. And what has happened is, obviously having information is power. And it has created incredible connectivity among a lot of different people, and the capability of spreading information very quickly or getting in touch with somebody very quickly. The contradiction that is created is the disaggregation of voices. And so, for instance, I think you also, I believe in political parties. But what has happened is that people, take for instance Tahrir Square. It came together with social media. So how do you get from Tahrir Square to governance?
Right.
Richard said I was chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. We believe in political parties, trying to figure out how you re-aggregate those voices and not have the, and you mentioned about people only listen to what it is they think they already know. So there is this connectivity, but also a separation as a result of it. And we haven't figured that out either. And I think one of the reasons that I think this kind of school is so important is to try to figure out how to readjust to these very big changes that didn't exist before.
Well, so if technology and the ability to really, technology makes so much of the geopolitical lines irrelevant. So how do you use technology for the better? The technological opportunity to empower people to have a voice could be a positive way to counter that, could it not?
Very much. I mean, let me just say there are a lot of, again, and we talked about it this summer at the Blum Institute, was that in fact what you hear from people that are really technologically capable is what happens in Kenya, for instance, where people have their mobile phones and they're able to pay their bills that way and not walk miles to send some money to the guy that they bought fertilizer from. They also can figure out what's happening to their crops. They can learn an awful lot about whether there's some influenza epidemic coming, given the kind of telephone calls that are going on. So there are huge opportunities in terms of trying to make the world better. And I just think that the issue is, I'm not opposed to the megatrends. I think that, obviously, but basically trying to figure out what it is that makes them, what are the contradictions that have been created by it.
So is the UN responding to any of these trends? Does the UN have a a role in the deployment of technology in a more cohesive or systematic way?
Well, they are trying to figure out what kind of rules to establish. The very hard part is that people don't want to give up some of their sovereignty in order to do it. The other part is that the UN, I think the UN does many very important things in terms of development issues, some to do UNICEF, or we may talk about this later, but what they do in peacekeeping operations. But it is a difficult place to run. And the United States is the major contributor, but we partially cause them to have a financial crisis. So it's a
because
I love
we're not
being
contributing our fair share.
Well, what we do is, this sounds when we actually have money, but the bottom line is our fiscal year doesn't begin until October, and most of life begins in January. And so we create a financial crisis in that way. And then when I was there, what was really embarrassing was there was a percentage in terms of how you pay for a peacekeeping budget, and we were supposed to be paying something like 32.3%. And then Congress decided unilaterally that we would pay 25%, leading our best friends, the British, to deliver a line they'd waited over 200 years to say, which was representation without taxation. Yeah. So we were demanding a lot of reforms, but we were creating some of the.
How do you get Congress to approve? How do you change the mind of those in Congress, not just on the UN, but foreign aid, et cetera? How do you make the case?
Well,
and aren't you concerned about?
I am. I'll tell you what I find interesting is budgets in terms of. I think most people haven't looked at what the overall budget looks like, and the budget is divided into functions. And
U.S. budget, you're talking about.
U.S. budget. Yeah. In general ways, the defense budget is function 050, and it has something like $700 billion in it. The international budget, the State Department budget, is function 150, and it has something like $60 billion in it. And so like 10 times the size, smaller than the defense budget. And I think often the question is asked, how much do you think goes to foreign assistance? Now, I personally would not call, the idea of putting foreign and assistance together is not an easy two names together. It would be better if it were called national security support or something. But you ask people, how much of the budget, of the federal budget, do you think goes to foreign assistance? And people say, well, 25%. And then they say, well, how much would you think should go to foreign assistance? And they say, well, 10%. And then you tell them it's 1%. And so there is this kind of mythology around the budget, which simply is not true, and trying to persuade people. Now, the hard part, and even I, bleeding heart of major proportions, had trouble explaining to people. I'd been to New Orleans after Katrina, and people would say, why would you give money to some country we don't even know where it is and they're killing each other for no good reason, when what we should be doing is helping our people in New Orleans? And I think it's not an easy argument to make. The bottom line is we actually are rich enough to do both. But when you put one against another, right, I think it is difficult.
Yeah, and it often gets lumped too in the defense budget. I mean, the rebuilding of of countries after we have intervened in wars, and people make that case: why are we building infrastructure there, and we should be building infrastructure here? Right. Just to get back quickly to the UN and Syria, I just want to ask a question about Syria for the moment, because there were some folks who asked this. There is this relatively new, I think, UN doctrine about responsibility to protect, and for those of you who don't know it, it's, according to the UN, sovereignty of a country no longer exclusively protects states from foreign interference. Sovereignty is a charge of responsibility that holds states accountable for the welfare of their own people, and therefore, if they are not living up to that, it would invite interference or intervention by the part of the global community. So the question is on Syria. What is your assessment of how that has been applied, not just by the U.S., but by the UN and the players who care about it?
You will be really sorry you asked this. So now let me talk about this, because one of the things that happened when I was at the UN, I was fascinated by the way that the peacekeeping operations worked. Initially, in the history of the UN, peacekeepers would go in after a fight in order to keep the parties apart once an agreement had been reached. And then when we were there, when I was there in the early 90s, was when it all got kind of messier with what was going on in the Balkans. And there was also issues in Somalia, if you remember, and in Haiti. And the question was, what do you do if there is no peace? Do you send people in? And we had a lot of discussions about what was appropriate. Could you create a UN peacekeeping force and go in there, even if the country didn't want you in there? But there were a number of times we were able to get a United Nations vote on it. Then what happened was in Kosovo, for instance, we couldn't go to we wanted to go to the UN, but the Russians made very clear they were going to veto it. And so President Clinton and I went to NATO, and we got a NATO operation to go in and stop ethnic cleansing. Probably the best international citizens in the world are the Canadians. And they began to look at whether there was a way to have human security so that you really worried what happened to the people. And there began to be, it's interesting
say that again, human security.
Which wasn't, just to make sure that people weren't killing each other, and that it was not a matter of taking territory, but to make sure that the people were secure. And to go back to something you asked me earlier, the international system does have a way of evolving and thinking through problems if people begin to look at them. So the Canadians put something down, and then the Australians, Gareth Evans, began to put forward this concept of responsibility to protect. And it turned into what you said, which was a General Assembly resolution. What was interesting was, after I left office, I did a project with former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen for the U.S. Institute of Peace on genocide prevention, trying to figure out what you could do ahead of time so people would not, what were the warning signs for that. And then that grew into another task force that I did with Rich Williamson, who unfortunately died recently, who Republican, who was Romney's chief foreign policy advisor. And we were going to look at this whole concept of responsibility to protect. Now, it does bump up against sovereignty, but the responsibility of the sovereign is, as you put it, to take care of his, mostly, people, and that's one thing, but obviously not to kill them himself. Mm-hmm. So that is contrary to what sovereignty is all about. And what did happen was the concept of responsibility to protect was used in Libya, just as we were doing this particular case study of it. And it got criticized because there was the sense that NATO had gone too far, with the permission of the Arab League, to in fact not just protect the civilians, but went too far to regime change. The problem with the concept of responsibility to protect it is now in the UN system is you have to go to the Security Council to get permission. So it's kind of blocked. So that's the main problem. And so I happen to believe, and this is the hard part, I'm a child of World War II, and one could say that we did not know what was going on with the Jews by the Germans. We now know everything that's going on everywhere. And so isn't there some kind of international responsibility, first, to be able to, let's say that the sovereign would like some help in trying to protect his people from whatever group is creating problems. And if he can't, then you go in. But it's a concept that's
Syria,
great.
Obviously, that's
the problem is that who does it?
Right.
You know, if you don't have any international permission. So it's the right thing to do, but there is no instrument to really carry it out at this point.
So what should be?
So I believe is that what should have happened, which goes back to is that we should have done something a lot earlier.
We should have unilaterally, or we should have gone to the Security Council earlier.
I think we could have done it with some ad hoc group to try to make sure that the rebels or the opposition, which had started out as a relatively peaceful operation in not thinking that they needed some rights, was to have more support initially before. Now I think it is incredibly complicated. because, in fact, they are penetrated by a number of different groups.
But how does it affect now that Iran? There's some complication. I mean, there's some sort of thaw with Iran, who's a big supporter of.
Well, I mean, I believe that what we're watching in the Middle East is just a massive kind of ink blot spread of a variety of problems. I worked for a president who read a lot, and he assigned books to us. So Bill Clinton told me to read a book that I think many people probably here have read. It's called The Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, who describes the creation of the modern Middle East after World War I. And the short version of the book is the modern Middle East was created out of the Ottoman Empire by the British and French bureaucracies lying to each other. And so the countries are artificial. They sat and they drew maps. And what has happened is that these artificial countries are now kind of coming apart. Most Americans did not know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni until some couple of years ago, and the Persians versus the Arabs. And so these countries, this is all spreading into this sectarian mess where Sunnis are supporting Sunnis and Shias vice versa. And I have to say, this is not a surprise to anybody who knows me, Iraq, I think the war in Iraq is one of the greatest disasters in American foreign policy. And the country that gained the most from it was Iran. And so that is the problem that we're now trying to deal with. And the Iranians we're trying to deal with whatever their nuclear plans are, but they also are supporting Shias in other countries. That's the simple version.
All right, so I'm going to switch gears slightly. You're doing a lot of traveling, even though you have hung up your high heels, or however, as Secretary of State. One of the countries you recently visited was Burma. You call it Burma or Myanmar?
I call it Burma.
Is Burma going to see democracy anytime soon?
It's a really fascinating story there. And every time I study it, the more complicated and fascinating it really gets. It is a country that has been ruled by the military for a long time. I call it Burma because I said I would until Aung San Suu Kyi called it Myanmar. But the bottom line is that 40% of the country are different ethnic groups. And I had not focused on the fact of how complicated the ethnic story is. And there are fights going on among the ethnic groups and the Burmans. And the part that is really hard to get my head around is that a lot of Buddhists are killing Muslims and various difficulties there. They also, Aung San Suu Kyi, who won an election in the end of the 80s, had been under house arrest for a very long time. She believes in democracy, and she had won fairly but was never able to run the country. The Constitution is written in a way which makes it, at this moment, impossible for her to run for president, because it says that anybody who has foreign children can't be president. She has foreign children. It's written specifically. And the way that it is set up, 25% of the parliament is run by the military. They have to have 25% of the seats in this constitution that was passed kind of quickly. And so the question is whether they will change the constitution. She would win, I think. And they are slowly trying to figure out some kind of semi-democratic government. And they're a fascinating place at the moment. I think they're trying to figure out how to adjust all this, how to move towards democracy. And there are other people that would like to run for president who are speakers of their lower and upper house. I think it is moving in that direction.
Moving.
I think it definitely is. I think the question is how to be able to support them. The sanctions have been suspended. How to make it possible to support them so that they move in that direction and see about changing the
Do the people there have access to technology?
They do.
Yeah,
they
so
do.
there's some ability
there is
to
more.
democratize
It's definitely opened
communication.
up. I went there in 1995 after the Women's Conference in Beijing, and I met Aung San Suu Kyi. We have actually stayed in touch all these years, and I think that her approach is that she's trying to work with the military in order to move the process forward. Sometimes people ask me who are the leaders that I admire the most, and there actually are three. Unfortunately, two of them are dead, Nelson Mandela and Václav Havel and Aung San Suu Kyi, because what all three of them were able to do is forgive their jailers. And so, they all, in some form or another, are trying to work with the people that made it very horrible for them.
Can I ask you, she's obviously a strong woman. You are a strong woman. Do you think we'll come to a point where we'll see a lot more representation of strong women at the negotiating tables of the globe?
I hope so.
Leading.
I mean, I think it is slowly happening. I think that one of the things that has to happen is to support women in various other political roles so that they can kind of move up and not just be imposed. I think that there are more and more signs of women that have been elected. One of the things that the National Democratic Institute has been doing is supporting women candidates throughout the world in terms of trying to move the process out. But I do believe that the world would be better if there were more women in leading positions.
And whoever our next president is, whoever she is, she'll have hopefully the ability to have a symbolic as well as substantive role in making some of that happen. All right, so I've got a bunch of questions from you all out here. First one is, thoughts on keeping Iran in check? How much would the U.S. help Israel in the case of war?
Well, first of all, I think that everything is being done so that whatever is happening with Iran, that it is not a threat to anybody, much less to Israel. Israel is an ally of the United States, and I think that my sense is that we would do everything possible. It would be better not to get to that point. I think the problem is trying to figure out what tools to use in dealing with Iran. And the President in the State of the Union message, I think, made it very clear that diplomacy is what we should be doing now, with a lot of verification of what is going on, but that no option is off the table. But I have no doubt that we can't make decisions for Israel about how it defends itself. I think that what we're trying to do is figure out a way where we can have sustained pressure on Iran to live up to these.
Are you encouraged by what you're seeing by the new leadership?
I am, but I think the thing we have to understand is that leaderships in the United States, in Israel, and in Iran are also involved in their own politics, and that Rouhani has some internal issues with his hard line people in order for him to say certain things. The same is true in all countries, and so I do think it's worth trying. I think it is worth moving down this.
All right. Is there an Obama doctrine?
I think there is.
And how would you describe it?
Well, first of all, I think that I know people will hate me for saying this, but because it's been 6 years, but President Obama is dealing with the problems that were left over by the last administration. And they are very serious issues in terms of trying to figure out where the United States belongs. As I've already said, I thought Iraq was a terrible war. Afghanistan, if we'd paid attention to it earlier, might have been solved earlier. And the president is dealing with that. What I think is interesting is I wrote a book called Memo to the President-elect, which when I didn't know who the president was going to be, I ultimately inscribed it to President Obama, and I wrote, with the audacity to hope that this book might be useful. And I laid out what I thought were the big issues that whoever it was supposed to deal with. And they were fighting terrorism without creating more terrorists, dealing with nuclear proliferation so the worst weapons didn't get into the worst hands, dealing with the international gap between the rich and the poor, And while there's no direct line between poverty and terrorism, it doesn't take a lot of imagination, the people that are alienated, to be recruitable. Then all the issues of energy, environment, global pandemics, and restoring the good name of democracy. So just listing those require, no matter how strong the United States is, to work with other countries. And so I believe that if there is an Obama doctrine, that it really is about partnership, and that you need to work with other countries to resolve the problems just by virtue of what the problems are. You already used the word multilateralism. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But it basically is partnership. And so I think if you listen to him, that is what he's talking about, is that the U.S. has to be engaged, but not alone. And President Clinton said it first, and I just said it so often it became identified with me, but indispensable. The U.S. is the indispensable nation, but there's nothing in the definition that says alone. And I think President Obama has taken that in the direction of the partnership. So that's what I would say.
So if the U.S. is indispensable, shouldn't the U.S. be at the forefront of signing on to global treaties to combat climate change?
Absolutely.
And so talk about that megatrend, not just the U.S.'s role, but the megatrend of what's happening to the globe in terms of climate change.
Well, that is a global, right. I mean, that if there ever was an issue that makes clear that we are interdependent, it's climate change. And yet, ultimately, what has to happen is different states have to make the rules in terms of how they will abide with carbon emissions and various ways of limiting what their issues are in terms of making the world hotter and various aspects of it. And I do think that this is one of the major aspects of it. But what has to happen, and this is true of all kinds of treaties, is our system is set up that the Senate has to give advice and consent, 2/3, on the ratification of treaties. Climate change is one of them. The Disabilities Act is another of them. The CEDAW about treatment of women. And for whatever reason, there is not belief among some members of the Congress that climate change actually has some scientific basis, or that women and children need to be protected, or that there needs to be disability treaties.
It all comes back to us, that we have to put people in place who believe.
I have to tell you what I find passing strange is that people who do not believe in government want to be elected to positions in the government.
Isn't that interesting? I think it is a curious form of self-loathing.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
What's the story behind your pin today?
Well, I just was feeling patriotic.
Okay.
Feeling red, white, and blue made a certain.
Did somebody didn't give that to you? That was just
no.
Your own
Part of my problem is the following: is the pins that have all the good foreign policy stories are in a show traveling around, so I have to start all over.
All right. So another question: is the Obama administration really engaging in a so-called Asia pivot?
Well, yes. Let me just explain. The United States is not monogamous. We are both an Atlantic and a Pacific power. It is, and I think what is very clear is that the major relationship that the United States has to have in the 21st, certainly in this part of the 21st century, is with China. That is the strategic relationship. And I think that rebalancing towards Asia has been absolutely essential and appropriate. The problem with it is that the Europeans, having now talked about, we had always hoped is that Europe, as the European Union, would be strong enough to be a partner with the United States on those issues that I mentioned earlier. And so it made sense to begin to look towards Asia to deal with some of the issues that the Chinese have raised generally and the role of Asia in the international system. The Europeans, however, are kind of nervous that we've abandoned them all of a sudden. And then somebody said to me, so what are you going to do about West Asia? And I thought, what is West Asia? It's the Middle East. So it is a little hard. So we are needed in many places. But I do think that there is an attempt to really move to an Asia rebalancing. The problem with it is that there are some in China who see it as a positive, some who see it as a kind of trigger for them to build up their military, which then is a trigger to some of our military to build up versus a hedge against the Chinese. But I do think we are both. We are an Atlantic and a Pacific power.
And so much of the pivot to Asia involves economics, right? And so some have said that the best diplomacy combines diplomacy with national defense and economic development. You were describing earlier, before we came in, some of the work that you've been doing in the Middle East to try to create economic opportunity. Why don't you talk about the role of the economy in diplomacy?
Well, let me say this. I teach a course at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And my course is called the National Security Toolbox. And the truth is there are not a lot of tools in the toolbox, even as powerful as we are. There is diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. Then there are the economic tools, which are the carrots are aid and trade, and the sticks are embargoes and sanctions. Then there's the threat of the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. So when you're looking into this toolbox as a diplomat, you try to figure out which ones make the most sense. I do think they all need to work together. But what is important, economic development, I think, is a huge issue. One of the things that, at least when I was in graduate school, which was forever, there was the question of what comes first, political or economic development. They go together because democracy has to deliver.
Just ask Chris Christie.
Yeah, well,
just kidding.
But
you've been reading the New York Times today.
The people want to vote and eat, and so you've got to be able to figure out how to do it. And I think that if we look at, let's take what's happened in the Arab world. When the first guy in Tunisia immolated himself, it was basically over the fact that he didn't have money to buy the vegetables that he needed and he had no economic dignity. And the immolations across North Africa were about economic dignity. So one of the things that happened was President Obama gave a speech in Cairo about having a different relationships with Muslim majority countries. And so Secretary Clinton wanted to kind of put meat on the bones. And so she asked me to run something called Partners for a New Beginning, which was trying to figure out how to do economic development with Muslim-majority countries. So what we have, our vertical mandate is to do economic empowerment, science and technology, education, and people-to-people exchanges, and then horizontally to get women and youth into jobs. So we are doing that. We have an American steering committee of non-state actors, and then local chapters in now 10 Muslim countries that kind of bring together economic development with the idea that people have jobs and are capable then of participating in their governments, which goes back to this issue we were talking about non-state actors, which are public-private partnerships where there is a relationship with the private sector and the public sector.
Which is important. They've got an important role in giving people dignity.
Absolutely,
What is this is a question from the audience, what's your assessment of the recent events in the Ukraine?
I think, again, let me go, what I find very interesting, I spent my life studying changes in communist systems, and I thought I would be out of work. And that it was basically archaeology. It is very difficult, I think, to see how communist systems can then change and be able to provide some form of democratic or any dictatorial system. What is a tragedy in Ukraine was that they had what's known as the Orange Revolution, in which people were out on the streets protesting, and they managed to elect a democratic government. The problem was that they also were not able, the prime minister and the president had difficulties in getting their act together. The communist-leaning group with Yanukovych came back in. What I find interesting is that the people with enough information now are back out on the streets. At the moment, it's complete mayhem. Because as of today, well, yesterday the Prime Minister resigned. Today, the President took a medical leave of absence, which is kind of weird. And the question is, what is going to happen? What I find interesting about this is what is the context of it. And what was happening was, I found this generally in Central and Eastern Europe that makes it a little different from what was happening in the Arab world. Once the wall came down, they all wanted to be Europeans. That was their major desire. They had been separated by the Iron Curtain, and they wanted to be Europeans. And so Ukrainians wanted to be part of the EU. And Putin, who would like to resurrect some form of the Soviet Union, basically said no way. And Ukraine is poor, and in terms of needing oil support and a variety from Russia, and because Yanukovych was more inclined towards... Ukraine is an interesting country. I mean, half of it is almost like two countries. The western part is much more pro-Western, democratic, and the eastern part is more pro-Russian. And so they were trying to figure out where they belonged. And one of the things that I was thinking about, this may go back too far, but after World War II, the U.S. offered the Marshall Plan to everybody in Europe. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and so he used to tell this story. Czechoslovakia wanted to join the Marshall Plan. The foreign minister of Czechoslovakia was summoned to Moscow and told no way. And the foreign minister came back to Prague. My father worked for him, and he said, I have recognized now that I am not the foreign minister of a sovereign country. In some ways, what Putin just did, telling the Ukrainians that they could not be part of the EU, is a modern version of the same story. And so because of information technology and more democracy, I think the Ukrainian people have said no way. But at the moment, it kind of looks like you can't tell what's going to happen. And I hope very much that the Ukrainian people can organize themselves and have a government that reflects their views and not those of Moscow.
So, speaking of Putin, if you were Secretary of State today, would you advise Americans to go to Sochi?
Actually, yeah. I mean, I think that, let me tell you what I think is, again, on something. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, this goes back to the toolbox, we were trying to figure out how to punish them for going into Afghanistan at the time. And I remember sitting in an interagency meeting trying to figure out, every department was trying to figure out what tool to put on the table. And one of them was forbidding our athletes from going to the Olympics. And we were punishing the athletes. And I think that that's something that we have, people were very concerned about that.
Right, I'm talking about on the safety side.
On the safety side. You know something, that is something that I stay out of. I just think that one has to look at what the various aspects are. It's a huge decision. I think if the United... You're
not saying stay out of Sochi. You're saying you would, if you were Secretary, stay out of advising people one way or the other?
Well, the Secretary, what has to happen at some stage is if there is a genuine threat, and it's hard to tell, is would you send an American delegation at all? That would be something I think that this stage would be made among a number of different people
who have access to the
who have access to it. But it's a very hard issue to decide on.
Yeah, it's I mean, especially since the U.S. is trying to make a statement as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's what I wish is that I hope that there is a lot of cooperation in terms of security on this.
Okay, some of you guys, you see this card? It's like a book. There's no way I can read all of that. I'm so sorry because these are really smart questions. But this one I particularly like. Does basketball diplomacy have any chance for success in North Korea?
So, well, let me just say this, is I take some responsibility for this.
You take responsibility for Dennis Rodman?
No. This is the problem. I am still the highest level sitting American official that went to Pyongyang.
Wow.
We knew very little about Kim Jong-il, this guy's father. And so I was told by our intelligence that he was crazy and a pervert. He was not
the
crazy.
father.
The father. He was not crazy. And so... and I'll tell you what
can I follow up? I mean, really.
No, but what happened was the following. We did not have an embassy there. So I had no idea what I was going to do. I go there and I sit in the guest house, and they say to me, you have to go and see his embalmed father before anything happens. So I had to go see the embalmed father. And then he agrees.
Wait, this was when?
This was in 2000.
So this was like the grandfather.
No, this is the father.
This is father. All right.
So then he agrees to see me. So we have a press conference, and I'm there talking with him, and we're about the same height. And I had on high heels, and then I looked over, he did too. And his hair was a great deal poofier than mine. But we had some very interesting discussions. But among the things I also was told was that he liked basketball and that he liked Michael Jordan. And so I did take over a basketball that was autographed by Michael Jordan.
You started
It
this
is in
whole
their
thing.
holy of holies. But I promise not to play basketball if Dennis Rodman never opens his mouth. But I do think that, not the way he was doing it. I do think that what needs to happen, and there's some evidence all of a sudden that there is some attempt at people-to-people relations. We don't know very much about Kim Jong-un, and so he certainly is not. I mean, he has just executed his uncle,
right?
And there are people who think that one of the reasons that happened is that he is weak, actually, not that he is strong. And so they're trying to figure out. And the president of South Korea has talked about a variety of people-to-people contacts. And so I think that's one of the things that always is worth pursuing.
Okay, so good stories about North Korea. Tell us another good story about a world leader that we might not otherwise know. You got anything up your sleeve that maybe somebody who's passed on? Or...
No, but I'd have to tell you things that you would never think a Secretary of State has to do. And so I just became Secretary of State, and I am told that I have to go to the ASEAN Regional Conference. That made a lot of sense. And then they said, you do realize at the end of this that there's always a dinner in which every country has to perform a skit, and the United States is really bad at this. So then they said, the State Department gave me lyrics to Mary Had a Little Lamb, and I said, I am not doing that. And so then you asked about Burma, and what had happened was they had just accepted Burma, the dictatorial military Burma, as a member of ASEAN, and I thought I shouldn't go, but I was told it was a good idea to go. So on the way over, we on the airplane decided that I would sing Don't Cry for Me, ASEANis.
Oh.
So I got dressed as Madonna, and I actually sang.
Come on!
I did. So, and the Russian foreign minister did a skit in which all he did was have a whistle and talk about, the Black Sea Fleet or something. So we then decided the following year, while we were having really serious discussions about Iraq, to the following year do a duet. And so we did our version of the West Side Story. We called it the East-West Story.
Nice!
And we developed these great lyrics. The night before we were in Manila that year, we had a rehearsal in MacArthur's Suite. The Russians brought a lot of vodka. The next day at this event, we had a rumble. I came out singing the most beautiful sound I ever heard, Yevgeny, Yevgeny, and he came out singing Madeleine Albright, Madeleine Albright. So those are the kinds of things that...
These aspiring secretaries of state in the audience, they're going to be taking voice lessons too. Okay, are there specific critical regions or policy areas that you feel America has not dedicated sufficient attention or resources to, and how should they be addressed?
Well, there are actually, but let me put that again. We have a very serious problem at the moment, which is that our resources, there's no question, in terms of the budget problems that exist, and also something else, which is that, and I think that This was very clear from the President's State of the Union message, which is that he believes, and all you have to do is look at the polling data, is that Americans are tired. There is great fatigue in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan. There's also a sense, I think Karzai is a perfect example of it, a lack of gratitude for what the United States has done. And so there are serious problems here at home, and there really is the sense that we need to dedicate ourselves much more to what is going on here. Mm-hmm. And I think that is part of the context that one has to think about, is how do you persuade anybody to go look at other parts of the world? I do think that it goes back to where I see that the United States has to be involved. I don't think we're paying enough attention to Latin America in many different ways. This is our natural kind of the alliance of the Americas and things that could be done. I also think that, and I actually think everywhere, you want to know. I mean, I'm worried about, as we come out of Afghanistan, what happens in Central Asia, how does that affect the relationship with India, China, the whole aspect of that. More people are killing each other and dying in various parts of Africa. So they're really practically everywhere. But then, of course, my business is international relations. And so I would like to persuade the American people that what happens abroad really does affect America in the long run. One, in terms of just economics in a number of different ways, and other in humanitarian ways. Americans, my problem is, I think Americans are the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And our problem is we want things solved, and they can't be, and they do take sustained effort, and there's always a problem somewhere else.
Yeah. All right, this is the last question for the charming and brilliant Madeleine Albright. What do you hope you will be remembered for? Name one thing from your days as a member of the cabinet.
Well, I would like to be remembered for something other than being the first woman Secretary of State. I'm very proud to be the first woman Secretary of State. But as my youngest granddaughter said when she was 4 years ago, what is the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. But I'll tell you what I really would like to be. And part of it, we all bring our own history with us. And a lot of it goes back to things that I've said in terms of what is the responsibility. I was not born in the United States. I was born in Czechoslovakia. I came here when I was 11 years old. And I am a child of World War II and of the Cold War. And my life story is one in which I can show when the U.S. isn't present, as was true for the earth-shaking events for Czechoslovakia, was Munich, when the British and French made a deal with the Germans and Italians over the heads of the Czechoslovaks, and the United States was not there. But then, and we were in England during World War II, when the Americans came in, everything changed. And then when, as a result of agreements made during World War II, Czechoslovakia was liberated by the Soviet Union, everything changed. And so I can trace for my own history of when the U.S. was involved in a good way, that it really made a difference. So all of a sudden, there I am, unexpectedly, first at the United Nations and then as Secretary of State, at a time that a part of the world that I really understood. My father, because life is so weird, had actually been ambassador to Yugoslavia. I understand Serbo-Croatian. So the bottom line is, I watched this country, the Yugoslavia, fall apart, and all of a sudden Serbs, whom I had grown up to, my father used to say, if he couldn't be a Czech, he'd be happy to be a Serb. He loved the Serbs. And so all of a sudden I see these people motivated by nationalism to start killing people of a different ethnic group and religion. So I was UN ambassador during Bosnia, and I worked very hard, but I wasn't Secretary of State. I was during Kosovo. And the question was whether we could do something to stop the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And I worked very hard, first in the administration, to persuade. President Clinton was for it, but the State Department has no airplane, so it had to persuade the Defense Department. And we managed that. And then, as I said earlier, the UN had blocked it. I managed to get NATO to move. And then the bombing started, and what happened was the weather was bad, and the Serbs put out decoys, and everything went wrong. And I came into my office one day, and my exec said, "Sit down." I said, "What?" He said, "Just sit down." I said, "What's the matter with you?" He said, "We just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And so all of a sudden they started calling it Madeleine's War, which was not as a compliment. When we won it, they called it something else. But the bottom line is that now there is a whole generation of little girls in Kosovo whose first name is Madeleine. And so if people ask me what I'm proudest of, it is what we did in Kosovo.
That is very cool. So please give her a round of applause. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Hang on, Dick's going to say a word, I think. There you are. Thank you.
Well, I think you've learned several things today. One is that not only was Madeleine the first woman Secretary of State, she has to go down as one of the most courageous, without any doubt. And she continues on. I've been with her recently to Jordan, visited Syrian refugee camps. As you can tell, it doesn't matter what part of the world you want to talk about, Madeleine can tell you about it, and I think we've all learned the lesson that we don't solve problems easily. And Jennifer, thank you so much for doing
great questions. Thanks to the group.
Good job. Now, yesterday, the University of California doesn't give out honorary degrees; they give out medals. Now, yesterday, Madeleine got the UCLA medal. We don't have, besides, I can't give out the UC medal anyway. The chancellor's got to do that. We have here something called the Campaign for Berkeley Bear Pin.
A pin! I love it. Great.
Well, wait a minute. This is kind of a lost leader. If you come back again, I'm going to talk to the chancellor about the Berkeley medal. Here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for great questions. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you all for great questions.
Great. Yeah, it was awesome. You're a wonderful attorney.